My dad grew up on a forestry in Queensland, Australia, as the son of a forest ranger. My whole life we've spent a lot of time out in that forest, camping and driving through parts of the forestry that only rangers would travel, and only occasionally. One place that Dad loved to take us was a little farm in the middle of the pines that was impossible to find if you didn't know the way. Locals knew the place as Spike's Hut. Spike was a local farmer who had lived there for decades up until the 90s, and had a reputation for being abrasive, violent, bigoted, and not concerned with the laws of men. He had a habit of approaching guys in bars who were wearing earrings and tear them straight out, and there were a few stories about people who displeased him disappearing. Basically, Spike was not a nice guy, and his farm and hut reflected that pretty well. Dad would take us out there every time we visited the forestry to camp, and the hut would be more and more run down, but the vibe was always the same, that straight-up feeling of being watched, even though Spike was long gone. As I got older, I became more aware of the signs of life in the place when we went to visit. There would be 44-gallon drums full of smashed beer bottles, fire pits with reasonably fresh coal. Someone was definitely out there. God knows why, since the place was literally a snake pit at that point. But Dad didn't seem concerned. One trip when I was a teenager got strange real quick. My friends and I were all piled into my dad's car, and we were driving through the bushes to Spike's hut, so Dad could tell his scary Spike stories and freak us out. We drove onto the property, and something immediately caught my eye. Up on the hill opposite to Spike's hut, there was what appeared to be a man, slumped against a log, head over his face, taking a nap. Something about his body position looked unnatural and uncomfortable. It wasn't the way you'd be sad if you were taking a casual nap in the middle of a workday, and even if it was, there was no reason for anyone to be out there. The farm was long unusable, and there was no forest business to be taken care of on the property. I pointed it out to my dad, and instead of letting us out of the car at Spike's as he usually did, he said he wanted to keep driving through the farm to show us something. He maintained that it was nothing, but that if the figure was still there when we came back through, we'd stop and check it out. Of course, whatever he wanted to show us seemed totally made up, as he just drove us through the forest a bit, and when we came back I spotted the slumped-over man again, not having moved an inch, still in that same unnatural position. I yelled out to Dad to stop, reminding him of his promise, but instead he acted like he couldn't hear me, locked the truck doors and drove off the farm, much faster than he ever drove on those dirt back roads. My friends and I all looked at each other in confusion, but we knew that when it came to this area, questioning my dad was futile at best, dangerous at worst. Dad denied that any of the events of that day ever happened, but my friends and I were still curious about what was going on out there. So a few months later we went camping on our own and set out to find Spike's hut. It took hours of driving through the forest to find the gate to Spike's property, but eventually we found it, without Dad's help. Something was off when we got there, more so than usual that day though. My mates jumped out of the car but were suddenly frozen, not wanting to walk any closer to the hut, for no visible reason. The vibe was just wrong that day, and it felt like we had walked into something that didn't belong to us. The tug in my gut to get out was strong, but I'd spent 2 hours finding the place, and I was going to explore it. One of my friends acted brave and walked from the car to the hut with me, quietly acknowledging more and more signs of inhabitants with knowing nods between us. We said nothing to the others, but we were on high alert. It felt like someone could be back any minute, or that they had never left and were watching us as we poked around the debris. We walked up to the side of the hut to find a kind of small shed with 3 walls. I heard my friend's voice go squeaky as he called me over to look inside. On the ground was a huge pile of ashes from what looked like a cooking fire, and confirming this was the presence of a giant makeshift grill, made from cross-hatched wire, sitting over the fire, hinged to the shed wall. As I'm looking at this setup, I figure that whoever has been here has been hunting and cooking large chunks of their kill over the fire. Pretty clever actually, but then my stomach dropped. As my eyes traveled down from the grill to the ground, I saw a baby's sock. Tiny, pink and terribly out of place. Then another, then a shirt, then a ribbon from a child's hair. All sitting right beside the ashes on the ground, next to a women's weekly Christmas cookbook. That's when the alarm bells in my head went off, and I rounded up my mates to get the hell out of there. Some ranger or crazy old guy hanging out at that trashed hut was one thing, but there was absolutely no reason for a baby to be out there, and there's no way anything good had come of having a child's clothes right by a huge fire and grill. When we got back to the campground, we couldn't shake the rotten feeling of being watched, and all of us were so unsettled that we packed up our stuff and decided not to stay the night. When I got home, I told my dad about it, and he just shook it off, saying weird stuff happens out there. Being young and dumb, I never thought to look up missing people in the area in an attempt to explain either the man or the kid's clothes. But I can tell you I will never make the mistake of going out to Spike's without my father again. Whenever I was scared as a kid, my dad had always told me that in life, you should not be scared of ghosts, fear the living because they can actually hurt you. In my late teenage years, I came into some money after my father committed suicide, and I received an inheritance from him. At time of my dad's passing, he and my mom owned a cabin up in Oregon by Mount Bachelor. The cabin had been put up for sale since my mom could no longer afford the payments, and renting it out was not covering the payments either. The cabin was set to go on the market for sale in less than a month and was in the process of finalizing all the paperwork with the realtor and lawyer. So for that month's time, the cabin was not going to be rented out any longer and was going to be vacant. I saw this as a chance to get away for a while and clear my head in light of all the things going on. I quit work, packed up my snowboarding gear, grabbed my dog and headed up in my dad's car that he had willed to me and drove to the cabin. Now this was our family cabin that my parents rented out throughout the year when we were not using it. I had keys to the cabin and also had the code for the alarms, so I did not feel the need to stop at the rental management company and advise them of my stay. My first 2 days at the cabin were normal and nothing out of the unusual happened. Spent my days playing with my dog in the snow, snowboarding, and the evenings playing PlayStation or listening to music, drinking and smoking out on the balcony. I had already stocked up on food, cigarettes and liquor, so I was pretty much a shut-in aside from the occasional out to hit the slopes. With my dog as company, DVDs and PlayStation as entertainment, I was quite content and started to feel relaxed after all the drama that had preceded my outing. The cabin itself was 2 stories. Bottom story had the living room and a side guest bedroom along with a small kitchen. Upstairs had another 2 rooms along with a walkout balcony attached to the master bedroom. Most of my time there was spent either in the living room, kitchen, or master bedroom. I never ventured into the other rooms and always kept the doors leading into them shut. Open doors to dark rooms always creeped me out. Anyhow, the 3rd day came around and I was going through my usual routine of playing with my dog, playing games and watching DVDs. My dog's name was Midnight, by the way, and he also since passed. That day it was pretty heavy snowfall, so I did not feel like trekking down the hill to the main road in my car and decided to stay in. That's when things started getting a bit weird. In our area there were only 2 other cabins adjacent to ours, maybe a block away from each other. All other cabins aside from these 2 were around a mile away from ours. Surrounding us was mostly forest and very tall pine trees. This is important later on. Both these cabins were empty, and from the past couple of days I knew that no one was currently staying there. Around midday, while outside with my dog, I noticed what looked like footprints in the snow around the area surrounding our cabin. It was still snowing, so the footprints looked semi-fresh, like someone had been there in the last 20 to 30 minutes before me. I thought that maybe someone was staying in the cabin near me that I may not have noticed. Maybe they were shut-ins like me. Alright, whatever. The prints lead away from my cabin and they disappeared in the snow towards the denser part of the trees. I disregarded the footprints and went back inside. Nighttime came around and decided to head to bed. My dog Midnight was laying on the bed with me when I noticed his ears perk up to a listening position. This was followed by him quickly jumping off the bed and running downstairs to the living room. I lay in bed and stayed silent. I was kind of freaked out, and could hear him moving around downstairs back and forth. After about 5 minutes, he ran back upstairs to me and started to do his doggy dance for the sign that he had to pee or that he wanted to go outside. Well, fine. I can't say no to him, so we both went downstairs to the outside driveway for him to do his thing. Only he didn't want to pee. As soon as we were outside, he started to pull on his leash, trying to drag me to where he wanted to go. He kept looking into the dense part of the trees where the prints had been earlier. But he also kept sniffing the side of the house and looking up towards the roof. After he figured out that I was not going to go to where he wanted, he sat himself down and just stared into the darkness. A bit unusual for him, but alright, maybe there are forest animals out there that he wants to chase down. But screw this. I did not want to chance anything, so I pulled him back inside and we both headed back upstairs. Around half an hour later, I was lying in bed when I heard what sounded like hooves walking on my roof. It was only a series of around 6 steps, and I rationalized that it could be a pine cone falling from a tree onto the roof, or maybe a kind-hearted forest animal running around. But here's the thing, the steps seemed to be spaced apart like a man-length stride. So it was really freaking me out. Midnight also heard the noise and was quick to run to the balcony screen door, expecting for me to let him out. Alright, you know what, I'm a tough guy and at the time considered myself to be fairly well built and strong enough to handle myself. So I grabbed my coat and shoes along with my cigarettes and flashlight and went out onto the balcony. Screw it, I thought. As soon as I was outside, I lit up my cigarette and started canvassing the roof with my light. Nothing there, and the snow on top was undisturbed. Must have been all in my head, I believe. What about Midnight hearing the noise too? Maybe he was feeding off my fear or paranoia. I started to calm down and relax again. By the way, I'm shaking right now and my heart is beating as I am typing this next bit. My eyes started to adjust to the darkness, and I kept smoking and just stared at the stars and trees next to our cabin. That's when I saw it. In a tree that was a little taller than our cabin and around 20 feet from the balcony, I saw what looked like a man crouched in a squatting position in between 2 branches. It was squatted on one branch, and its arms were extended above its head, holding onto the branch above it. The hell is that, I thought to myself. I wasn't sure if I was really seeing this thing, and stood just staring and sat there motionless. I noticed Midnight stand up and start pacing behind me and lightly barking at the same time. The thing still did not move. I put my cigarette out, and was debating on shining the light in the thing's direction, but something in my head kept screaming not to. So I walked backwards to the inside of the room and pulled Midnight with me. Once inside, I locked the door and shined the light in the thing's direction, but there was nothing there. I shut the curtains to the screen door and retreated back to bed. But later on in the night, I heard light tapping at the screen door, like someone was tapping on the glass with their fingers. It was consistent and did not stop for nearly an hour. Midnight seemed to stare at the door, but he wouldn't go near it anymore. The weirdest part was that I had a feeling like someone was inviting me to open the door. But at the same time, I kept hearing my dad's voice in my head telling me to stay in bed and not do it. I listened to my dad's voice and just stayed where I was. I fell asleep eventually and woke up in the morning to everything being normal. The rest of the week I spent there was non-eventful, and nothing else out of the ordinary happened. I totally admit that it could have been all in my head. A lot of stuff was going on at the time, so I was pretty messed up from all the drama. A few years ago, I did an aircrew survival training course with the Army, where we learned everything you would need to know to live in the woods for an extended period of time if you downed your aircraft. The course covered everything from wild edibles to signaling overhead aircraft for help. The final test was one of the most challenging and terrifying experiences of my life. We were to hike 10 miles into the woods, find a clearing and set up camp, with nothing but a combat knife, field ration and a very basic med kit. We were told by our instructor that due to an incident last year with somebody succumbing to the tolls of being alone in the woods, a combination of loneliness, boredom and the thought that you aren't going to be rescued can drive even the most confident outdoorsman mad, that we were to remove our belts and leave them at base. We drove in a big vehicle up a logging road to our location. We were each given a specific grid location, each at least 5 miles away from any other person. We were given instruction to hike to our location. Mine was almost an 8-mile hike through densely wooded marshland, and radio to win. or if we reached our location. I had to change my location because my grid left me in a pond. I camped on the shore instead for obvious reasons. I got my bearings, planned out what I was going to do for shelter, and settled in for my 5-night stay there. Completely on my own. I decided since the weather was good and I wasn't planning on staying there for too long, that I'd opt for minimal shelter and focus more on food and water collection. Water wasn't hard to find. There was a stream just outside of my camp. I put all of my effort that first day into setting traps to catch small game, pitfalls, rabbit snares, and deadfall traps. I thought if I'm gonna set traps, I may as well set something to catch me a deer. I crafted a swing spike. Essentially, I bent a strong tree branch back and attached several sharp spears to it, and connected a trip wire system. I was very proud with my work. It would have definitely taken down a medium-sized deer. Everything was pretty uneventful the first few nights. Aside from wolves howling in the distance, it was quiet. For the first time in my life, I heard nothing but the sound of the woods. It felt surreal. On the third night, I heard the swing trap go off. It made a hell of a noise when it hit the tree beside it, which was discouraging, meaning it didn't hit its target. I woke up that morning late in the day. The sun was already high in the sky. First thing on my mind was to check my small game traps. I hadn't had anything to eat since the second night, and the only thing in my belly was water. I went to reset the swing trap and saw something strange. There was blood on one of the spears. The wound must have been deep. The blood covered the first 2 inches of the spear. I noticed something strange near the trap, what looked like a man's bare footprint. I hadn't taken my boots off outside the shelter, and there is nobody around for miles. I get a little uneasy knowing that someone is around, and wounded. What was weird is there was no trail of blood to follow, especially with a wound of that size. The trap would have hit him square in the hip. I decided to return back to my camp and snack on some nearby cucumber leaf, a local plant that grows in the Canadian Maritimes. It's a broadleaf plant that tastes like cucumber and berries. Suddenly a wave of guilt washes over me. I may have killed an innocent wanderer or some weird hermit living in these woods. But I was given very strict instructions not to go more than 200 feet outside my grid bubble. I decided to radio in the incident to command. They told me somebody would look into it. 15 minutes later, I hear a helicopter circle overhead for about 5 minutes, land about a mile away, and leave quickly. Must have been an air ambulance to pick up my victim or something. The fourth night was strangely quiet. No bugs humming, no wolves in the distance, no wind, nothing. It was the closest thing to silence I have ever witnessed. Out of nowhere, every hair on my body stood on end, as if the air around me had been electrically charged. I felt like I was being watched, not just that uneasy feeling you get when you're alone in the woods. I knew I was being watched. A quick gust of wind blew over my shelter. The air was freezing cold. I could see my own breath. The deer trap goes off again. It doesn't hit the tree this time. I'm scared stiff. I'm not leaving this shelter to investigate. Suddenly something breaks the silence. A cough unlike anything I've heard a person make before. It was almost mechanical, almost like the voice of someone with an electronic voice box. It was rhythmic, one cough every 2 seconds or so. The coughing was the only sound. No background noises chimed in from the woods. I gather the courage to look through the entrance of my shelter, so I can see what is making that noise. Just outside my shelter is a barefoot man, with tattered jeans around the ankle. I was petrified. I curled back into my shelter, and for the first time in my life, I accepted death. I accepted that if whoever was out there wanted to kill me, he could. I cried myself to sleep that night. For the next day and night I stayed in my shelter, too afraid of whatever was out there to leave. I was woken the 6th day by my sergeant. It was past noon. He was worried I had been injured on my way back to the extraction point. On the hike back to base, I asked him about the helicopter. He told me not to worry about it. I let it go for about 10 minutes before asking again. He noticed that I was genuinely concerned. It was a body recovery. Corporal J hung himself with a rope he made, my sergeant said. You were friends, right? He asked me like he knew the answer was yes, and handed me a note. I tracked him to your site. I know I shouldn't have, but I did. He kept coughing and whispering in a language I had never heard before, but understood. He wanted a soul. He told me to do this to save you. The man with black eyes wanted you.